Hello and welcome back. Once again, I'm your instructor, Dawn Lukas, and today we'll be looking at Chapter 8 on grammar and punctuation usage in my textbook, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. Specifically, this video will focus on improving your understanding of the building blocks of grammar and helping you to avoid the most common grammatical errors in sentence structure, run-ons, comma splices, and sentence fragments. As I talked about in a previous video, if you're a native speaker of English or have been attending English-speaking school since you were very young, then you have an instinctive knowledge of how to use words from listening to educated people use them for more than a decade. Your experience is so powerful that you can often tell something just doesn't sound right, even if you don't know why or the name of the rule. In fact, studies have shown that being taught to identify parts of speech does not automatically lead to better writing. For one thing, there's a lot of ambiguity of form when you take words or phrases out of isolation and start using them in real life. For example, the word dog, most people would agree, is unambiguously a noun. A dog, two dogs, etc. However, in the phrase a dog house, this noun is suddenly an adjective. Be aware that words can sometimes change roles depending on the context. On the other hand, knowing labels does provide a clear and convenient way to talk about grammar, which is why you will be learning a bit about it, not to memorize the labels themselves, but rather to learn a sense of the types of words and be able to recognize common errors. Once people had observed and recorded different ways that language structure got used, they started thinking about which way was better or worse. In reality, what is considered correct or incorrect is just a matter of what is accepted by the discourse community or the society, and it changes over time and across dialects, as you saw in the last video. Once various grammatical rules for the different dialects were recorded, one dialect was picked to be a prestige dialect, in our case, the dialect known as Standard English. This led to the perception that unless you follow the rules of that described system, you are wrong. And it is important to be able to use Standard English grammar correctly, since it can enhance understanding, avoid confusion and miscommunication, and communicate to your readers that you are an intelligent, educated person who is worth listening to. So then, as you can see from this list, the importance of grammar doesn't lie in being able to label parts of speech. Benefits of grammar are derived from knowing how to use it correctly, whether or not you remember the labels correctly. In my view, the important part of grammar is how to use it to make yourself understood clearly and to convey an impression of intelligence and education. The names don't matter. The usage does. In fact, as mentioned a moment ago, numerous studies have shown that even when students can identify or label structures in isolated examples, they still don't recognize them or their purposes in real-life situations or discourse. Therefore, while it's useful to know the names in order to be able to discuss grammar and recognize errors in using the Standard English dialect, keep in mind that application is the key. When you study grammar, you learn to analyze language by breaking sentences into separate pieces in order to focus on individual parts, to recognize what the parts are, and to understand how these parts function together to convey meaning. Just like we looked at the structure of a paragraph to better understand how to build and evaluate them, and just how we looked at the structure of expository essays to better understand how to build and evaluate them, today we're going to look at the structure of sentences to better build and evaluate them, focusing in the end on how to avoid the three most common sentence errors: run-on sentences, comma splices, and fragments. As we will see when we go over division in the Patterns of Development chapter, dividing something into its parts is a good way to understand it. After all, we do that all semester with the various parts of the writing process. In order to discuss more advanced concepts, first I want to remind you of the basics. A noun is a person, place, or thing. There are proper nouns that refer to a single unique entity and should be capitalized, and common nouns that shouldn't be capitalized. For example, Santa Rosa Junior College should be capitalized, but college shouldn't. Pronouns take the place of a noun. However, they can't take the place of a noun if the noun isn't there in the first place. This is a particularly common error with it and they. People use these words without saying what it is or who they are. Make sure to specify before using a pronoun. One way to make your papers more specific and focused is to go through checking every it and they to see if you can replace it with a better word and if the reference is clear. Pronouns only exist to avoid redundancies. Don't overuse them. Verbs are action words and the most important part of the sentence for several reasons. One is that they determine what else goes in the sentence. In this sense, there are three types: intransitive verbs that don't need anything else, he ran; transitive verbs that need an object, what or who the action is being done to. You wouldn't say he gave or he tied. There are also linking verbs, is, seems, looks, that have an adjective or other non-noun word needed. However, this illustrates what I was discussing earlier. Even if you've never heard of intransitive or transitive verbs, you know you can't write he gave, period. Another reason that verbs are so important is that because they are the ones that show tense and aspect, they place the events contained within the sentence in a clear chronological relationship. Which events happen before or after other events? For example, the rain fell means that it did so before now. The rain is falling means that it's currently doing so. The rain was falling means that during the time being talked about, which is previous to right now, the rain was in the process of falling. The rain had fallen means that during the time being talked about, which is previous to right now, the rain had finished the action of falling. This is discussed in detail in the chart on page 200 of your textbook. However, the most relevant reason that verbs are important in writing to you is that they provide vividness and action in the sentence. In a study on the nature of memory led by Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer in 1974, researchers showed groups of test subjects short 5 to 30-second film clips of car accidents and then asked this question: how fast were the cars going when they blank? The blank was filled in with contacted, bumped, hit, collided, or smashed. The groups who were asked how fast the cars were going when they smashed responded with the highest estimates of speed, 40.8 miles per hour on average, and the groups who were asked how fast the cars were going when they contacted responded with the lowest estimates of speed, 31.8 miles per hour, even though all were shown the same film. Palmer and Loftus then did a follow-up study with everything the same, except they asked whether there was broken glass at the scene. There wasn't. Loftus and Palmer discovered that the intensity of the verb affected people's opinions on whether there was any broken glass at the scene, with the more intense verbs influencing more study participants to think there was broken glass. This shows that verbs create specific images in the reader's mind. Because verbs are the words in a sentence that express action and movement, they're usually the most important, engaging, and dynamic part of the sentence. The more specific and carefully selected your verbs in speech and writing, the more effective you'll be at communicating and getting the reader's understanding to match your intention. Suppose you wrote, "No," she said, and left the room. Grammatically, there's nothing wrong with this sentence. It doesn't break any rules, but because the words said and left are some of the blandest, most general, vaguest, and least descriptive, you've missed the chance to create a vivid word picture that communicates much more. For example, if I said, "No," she cackled and flew out of the room, you get an image of a witch. Or if I said, "No," he slurred and stumbled out of the room, you get an image of someone drunk, with a reader's schema or knowledge from experience filling in likely details, making the scene more engaging and memorable. Adjectives describe nouns. An interesting aspect of adjectives is that they go in a particular order. Again, something most native speakers know at such a deep level that they aren't even aware of it. Adjectives follow this order: opinion or observation, beautiful, difficult, fast, interesting. Size, small, short, big, enormous, tiny. Age, young, old, new, historic, ancient. Shape, round, square, rectangular. Color, red, green, purple. Nationality, French, Asian, American, Canadian, Japanese. Material, wooden, metallic, plastic, glass, paper. And finally, purpose or qualifier: fold-out sofa, fishing boat, racing car. You wouldn't say the French black old poodle. You would say the old black French poodle. You wouldn't talk about Italian tasty food. You talk about tasty Italian food. You don't talk about a carving steel new knife. You say a new steel carving knife. Again, you don't have to learn this to know that one sounds wrong. Adverbs describe verbs or other non-nouns. They often end in ly, although not always. For example, good is an adjective, but the adverb version is well. Thus, I am a good speaker, but I speak well. Remember to use the right one, adjective versus adverb. The detective is cautious, but he looks cautiously. Prepositions show the relationship of a noun to another noun or noun phrases. Only nouns. A preposition usually indicates the temporal, spatial, or logical relationship of its object, the noun it refers to the rest of the sentence. For example, the book is on the table. The book is beneath the table. The book is leaning against the table. The book is beside the table. She held the book over the table. She read the book during class. She read the book before class. These are all examples of prepositions relating a book to a table or class time. Conjunctions connect or relate words, phrases, or clauses. So they are like prepositions, but can do more, like connecting two verbs or two whole sentences. We'll see them in this role in a little while when we get to clauses, when we will discuss conjunctions in more detail. So, now that we've established the basic knowledge of what the parts are called, let's look at grammar in action. Let's begin by looking at a most basic sentence. What does a sentence need to be a sentence? A noun and a verb? So let's start with a basic, simple, short, two-word sentence. He ran. In order to be a complete thought, any sentence needs an action, a verb, and someone or something, a noun, doing the action. Now, most sentences aren't as simple as this, so let's make it a little more complicated, building from the basic premise that a sentence has a noun and a verb, and see how we can refine that idea to bridge to more useful and helpful tips and tricks. Here we have a slightly more normal, complicated sentence. The old man ran slowly. Take a moment to look at this and think about whether this sentence too has two basic parts and what words are involved. Pause the presentation if you'd like. We'll be looking at the answers to these questions on the next slide. Here you can see that each of the words in the sentence is labeled. The is an article, a part of speech we didn't review since it's not as central. The only other article in English is a or an. Old is obviously an adjective describing the noun man, and ran is a verb, with the adverb slowly modifying it. You can see that both the and old sort of go with man, since that's what they're describing. And in the same way, slowly goes with running, since that's what it is describing. Therefore, this sentence, though more complicated than he ran, still basically has two parts. It has the noun and everything that goes with it, which is known as a noun phrase, and the verb and everything that goes with it, which is called a verb phrase. So then, a more accurate definition of a sentence would be that it is a noun phrase together with a verb phrase. However, there is more to it. Let's move on to the next step, leading to the final understanding of how a sentence works, which can be the key to understanding most of the grammar rules that can be difficult or frustrating otherwise. Now we make things a bit more complicated. Up to this point, we've been discussing parts of speech, and that is what is labeled here in the white boxes: noun, verb, adjective, etc. However, beneath, we have the parts of sentences labeled. The subject is a noun phrase, specifically the one containing the noun doing the action and all of the words that go with it. You can see that in this case, not only does it contain not one, but two nouns, it also contains a verb. This clearly demonstrates that it isn't just the part of speech that you have to pay attention to, although that can be useful to know. The part of the sentence is even more important, especially in correcting the types of grammatical errors common to native speakers. Notice, for example, that contrary to what you might have learned in grade school, it isn't just a noun and a verb that makes a sentence. Ran down after breakfast isn't a sentence despite having one of each, and neither is wearing red sweatpants. In this case, wearing is a verb that isn't the actual action of the sentence. I don't expect you to memorize that. I just want you to be aware that just because something is a verb doesn't make it the predicate, the main verb of the sentence, which is why it's more useful to think of predicates and subjects than just nouns and verbs. This also illustrates what I mentioned earlier with doghouse, that it is the role of the word in context that's important, not just the word by itself. Another way to think about it is that the part of the sentence matters more than the part of speech. Now, we know that the subject of the sentence is the noun doing the action. We have two nouns here in the section labeled for subject, man and sweatpants. Which one do you think is the subject of the sentence? If you were thinking man, you are right. The sweatpants are just a description of what he's wearing, and thus part of the noun phrase, since it's describing him. The key to finding a subject is to find the noun doing the action, and the noun phrase will be all of the words that describe it, rather than describing what it is doing, which brings us to the second part of the sentence. You can see that the second has only one verb, which obviously has to be the main verb for the sentence. Our subject is man, and the action he's doing is running. However, he isn't just running. We get a description of how the running occurs, slowly, where the running occurs, down to the beach, and when the running occurs, after breakfast. As you can see, all of these are just descriptions of the running, making it more specific, and thus are part of the verb phrase that makes up the predicate in this sentence. So then, the next step on our quest to understand the parts of a sentence is understanding that all sentences contain a subject, which is the noun phrase about the noun doing the action, and the predicate, which is the verb phrase containing the action the subject's doing. But wait, you might wonder, what about sentences when there is more than one thing doing an action? Let's look at that next. In this final example, we can see that there are in fact two subjects carrying out two different actions. The cat is running and the dog is barking, which means that we have two subjects and two predicates. You can see that they are clearly one sentence, however. They are joined together with the word after. Clearly, after the dog barked is not a complete sentence by itself, and neither is the cat ran away after. This brings us to a new point. Even though a subject plus a predicate doesn't guarantee a sentence, it does guarantee a clause. That is what a subject and a predicate together are called. Therefore, this sentence has two clauses. The cat ran away and the dog barked. And the word after is acting in this case as a conjunction because it is joining two clauses, even though it would be a preposition if we used it another way, like the dog ran after the cat, which would have only one clause, with the dog being the subject and ran after the cat being the predicate. Now we have come to the point where your knowledge of grammatical terms is such that I can tell you the final and correct definition of a sentence: a complete thought made up of one or more complete clauses. Clauses are the key, both to understanding sentences and to avoiding the most common grammatical mistakes. The next step on our journey to understanding how to avoid common grammatical mistakes is to look more in depth at clauses. Take heart, we are almost there. Here we have two versions. On the left we have the dog barked. On the right we have after the dog barked. These differ in an important way that shows the difference between the two main types of clauses, independent and dependent. First, the dog barked is clearly a complete sentence. It doesn't need anything more to make it a complete thought. This means that it is an independent clause. It could be a sentence by itself. You can have more than one clause in a sentence, but it could be a sentence on its own. The dog barked is a sentence. The dog barked and the cat meowed is also a sentence. On the other hand, after the dog barked is missing some information. In order for it to be a complete thought, we need to know what happened after the dog barked. The conjunction after is joining or relating it to something, so that something needs to be present for the sentence to be complete. After all, it's connecting two things in a chronological relationship, but it only has one thing to connect, the one that happened second. Therefore, this is a dependent clause, one that cannot stand as a sentence on its own and needs more information to make it a complete thought. So then, the difference between an independent clause, which could be a sentence on its own, and a dependent clause, which needs another half to make the sentence complete, is basically just the presence of a subordinating conjunction. Most dependent clauses are basically independent clauses with a subordinating conjunction added, like in the example above. Almost always, a dependent clause is different from an independent clause because of extra words like because, if, or when. Being able to tell a dependent clause from an independent one can help you avoid the most common grammatical errors. Finally, as you saw in the last few slides, clauses are the basic building blocks of all sentences. A single sentence can have one clause or many, but clauses are what form all sentences. Any sentence will always have a whole number of clauses, 1, 3, or 13, but never 1.5. A sentence is always one or more complete clauses. Also, all sentences must contain at least one independent clause. The most basic kind of sentence is just an independent clause by itself, as we saw with he ran, where he is the subject and ran is the predicate. Now you have all the information you need, and we can proceed to seeing how all of this can help you avoid the most common sentence errors. Since every sentence is made up of a combination of clauses, often mixing dependent and independent, all you have to do to know the allowable ways to join clauses, and you'll never write a run-on sentence again. There are only 3 correct ways to join together 2 independent clauses, as you can see illustrated on the chart in this page. They could be joined with a period, I was hungry, period, I ate dinner, period. They could be joined with a semicolon. I was hungry, I ate dinner. Or they could be joined with a comma and a coordinating conjunction. I was hungry, comma, so I ate dinner. This last example also demonstrates the correct use of a semicolon. They can only go where a period can go. There are only two ways to join a dependent clause to the independent clause that it is depending on. Which you should use is determined by which of the two clauses comes first. If it is the dependent one, you use a comma. If it is the independent one, you don't. Now, using this pattern, you should be able to correctly punctuate any series of clauses. No matter how many clauses a sentence has, they are all either dependent or independent. And using this guide, you can correctly punctuate any of them, which is one of the reasons that this chart is also on the tear-out guide for the chapter. Now that you've seen the basic patterns, let's look at how they can be used to avoid the most common sentence errors: fused sentences, also known as run-ons, comma splices, and sentence fragments. The first type of common error is the run-on sentence, also known as a fused sentence, where two independent clauses are joined with no punctuation at all, such as in this example. Since there are three possible correct ways to join two independent clauses, there are three possible ways to fix the error. Add a period and make it two sentences, add a comma and coordinating conjunction, or add a semicolon. When two independent clauses are joined with only a comma, leaving out conjunctions, that is a comma splice. You can see it illustrated in this example. The usual way to fix it would be to add the missing conjunction, as you can see here. You would want to pick the best conjunction to express the relationship between the two parts. So, but, and mean different things. The other type of common error is a sentence fragment. Sentence fragments are groups of words that cannot stand alone as a sentence, but are mistakenly punctuated as though they were. Phrases that are not part of a complete clause. Therefore, it's missing one or more of the following: a subject, noun phrase, a predicate, verb phrase, or a complete thought. Usually, if a fragment is not a complete thought, it's because it has a conjunction such as if or when that has made it a dependent clause. Now you have the vocabulary and knowledge to understand many of the underlying rules of standard English grammar, with particular attention paid to building the foundation necessary to understand not only how to avoid the most common punctuation errors, but also why. I hope that this video lecture has helped you come to a clearer and more comfortable understanding of grammar terms and concepts. I look forward to joining you for another video lecture next time.